Imagine a city wrapped in stone and fog. November 1874. Blenheim Palace rises from the Oxfordshire countryside like a monument to a world that believed itself eternal. A world of grand ballrooms, gilded halls, and the quiet certainty that aristocratic blood carried with it the weight of destiny. It was here, in one of the most magnificent houses in all of England, that a child arrived 2 months too early, small and fragile, born into a family that was both celebrated and quietly fracturing at its core. His name was Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, and from the very first breath he drew, nothing about his life would be simple. What you're about to witness is not the legend. It is the man, with all his contradictions, his wounds, his terrifying clarity, and his almost irrational refusal to accept defeat. A man who spent decades being dismissed, humiliated, and written off, only to stand alone at the edge of the darkest moment in modern history and say with absolute conviction that his nation would not bend, would not break, would not surrender. This is the story of how that man was made. The halls of Blenheim Palace were not warm places for children. Lord Randolph Churchill, Winston's father, was a man of blazing political ambition and cutting personal coldness, a combination that left little room for tenderness toward a son he considered, with barely concealed disappointment, to be ordinary. Lord Randolph's career had been meteoric. By 1886, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, the youngest man to hold that office in over a century. He moved through London's political circles with the energy of someone who believed he was destined to reshape the empire. His wife, Jenny Jerome, daughter of a New York financier, possessed of extraordinary beauty and formidable intelligence, was equally consumed by the social theater of Victorian aristocracy. Together, they were the most glamorous couple in London, and together they were largely absent from the life of their eldest son. Winston was sent to boarding school at the age of 7, not because he was ready, not because he wanted to go, but because that was simply what was done. His first school, St. George's in Ascot, was a brutal place, a world of cold dormitories, strict masters, and corporal punishment administered with the birch. The small boy who had been accustomed to the warmth of his nanny, Elizabeth Everest, now found himself alone in a world that had no interest in his feelings. It was Mrs. Everest, whom Winston called with the unguarded affection of a child starved for love, Woomany, who truly raised him. She wrote to him. She listened to him. When Winston poured out his troubles, it was to her that he turned, not to the mother who forgot to answer his letters, and not to the father who had already decided his son was a disappointment. Years later, Churchill would write about her death with a rawness that revealed everything. She had been my dearest and most intimate friend during the whole 20 years I had lived. I shall never know such a friend again. At Harrow, Churchill's academic record was, by any measure, poor. He showed little interest in Latin or mathematics, lingered at the bottom of his class, and seemed to his teachers to be a boy of no particular promise. His father, watching from a distance with growing frustration, concluded that his son was not fit for a career in law or politics. The military would have to do. And so the decision was made, not in consultation with Winston, not with any attempt to understand what the boy might actually want, but as a kind of verdict handed down from above. Churchill attempted the entrance examination to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst 3 times before he passed. 3 times. His father's response was not encouragement. It was a letter of withering contempt, a letter so cold, so precise in its articulation of parental disappointment that Churchill kept it for the rest of his life. Lord Randolph wrote that his son was heading toward becoming a social wastrel and a failure, a burden to himself and to his family. He told his own son in writing that he did not believe Winston possessed the qualities required to succeed at anything meaningful. What Lord Randolph could not have known, what perhaps no one in that world of drawing rooms and riding clubs could have seen, was that the wound he inflicted with that letter would become the engine of everything that followed. Winston Churchill spent the remainder of his life proving his father wrong, and in doing so, he changed the course of history. Once accepted at Sandhurst, something shifted, away from the subjects he found meaningless and immersed in military tactics, horsemanship, and history. Churchill came alive. He graduated 20th in a class of 130. He devoured books with a ferocity that suggested not a casual reader, but a man trying to build himself from the inside out. Plato, Edward Gibbon, Charles Darwin, Thomas Macaulay. He read them all late into Indian nights by lamplight in the barracks of a regiment stationed far from everything he had known, trying to repair through sheer intellectual will what a formal education had failed to give him. He was also, by then, a young man with a speech impediment, a lateral lisp that made the letter S difficult to pronounce clearly. In a different man, this might have been a quiet limitation. In Churchill, it became a project. He drilled himself relentlessly, repeating phrases until his articulation was precise, until the impediment was not erased, but transformed into something distinctive, a voice unlike any other, a cadence that would one day hold a nation together in the darkness. Now pause for a moment and consider the extraordinary distance between that lonely boy at St. George's writing unanswered letters to his mother and the man history would demand him to become. What do you think shaped Winston Churchill more, the wounds of his childhood or the ambitions he built on top of them? Leave your answer in the comments. The story has only just begun. By the turn of the 20th century, Winston Churchill had survived Cuba, India, Sudan, and South Africa. He had been captured by Boer forces during the Second Boer War and had escaped, alone, at night, across hundreds of miles of hostile territory in an act of audacity that made him briefly famous across the British Empire. He had written books, he had given speeches, he had been elected to Parliament at the age of 25. And then the long, bruising education in political reality began. Churchill was never easy to place. He crossed the floor of the House of Commons from the Conservatives to the Liberals in 1904, infuriating his former colleagues. He championed radical social reforms, minimum wages, labor exchanges, unemployment insurance, positions that made him a traitor to his class in the eyes of the aristocracy from which he had come. He was brilliant, unpredictable, exhausting, and impossible to ignore. He was also, as events would prove, capable of spectacular, consequential failure. In 1911, Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty. He modernized the British fleet with remarkable foresight, preparing it for a war he could see approaching long before most of his colleagues were willing to acknowledge it. When the First World War arrived in 1914, he was ready, or believed he was. The disaster that followed was not born of incompetence alone, but of a bold strategic vision pursued with insufficient resources in the wrong conditions against the wrong resistance. Gallipoli. The name still carries a weight that is difficult to fully convey. Churchill had conceived a plan to force the Dardanelles Strait, neutralize the Ottoman Empire, and potentially shorten the war by years. The idea was not without strategic merit, but the execution was catastrophic. Allied forces landed at Gallipoli in April 1915, and what followed was 8 months of senseless carnage, men pinned against beaches, dying in their thousands, achieving nothing. When the campaign was finally abandoned, more than 250,000 Allied soldiers had been killed or wounded. Churchill was made the primary scapegoat. He was stripped of his role at the Admiralty, demoted to a minor cabinet position, and then removed from government entirely. At 40 years old, with his reputation in ruins and his career apparently finished, he did something that very few men in his position would have had either the courage or the self-awareness to do. He left politics. He joined the army. He went to the Western Front, not as a general, not as an observer, but as a lieutenant colonel, commanding a battalion in the trenches of Belgium. The men under his command were initially skeptical. This was, after all, a politician in uniform, a man associated with failure and disgrace. But what they found was something unexpected. Churchill in the trenches was calm, disciplined, attentive to his men's welfare in a way that was genuinely unusual for an officer of his background. He issued orders for better sanitation. He concerned himself with morale. He led from the front. The disaster of Gallipoli had not broken him. It had stripped away whatever remained of his political vanity and left something harder, something more essential. He returned to politics in 1917 and held several significant posts through the 20s and into the early 30s. But by 1931, Churchill was politically isolated in a way that was, even by his own turbulent standards, extreme. He had quarreled with his party over India. He had supported King Edward VIII during the abdication crisis of 1936, a position that was deeply unpopular. He drank heavily. He painted obsessively. Landscapes and portraits produced in his country house at Chartwell in the rolling Kentish countryside, as the world outside rearranged itself into something terrifying. And through all of it, the drinking, the debt, the isolation, Churchill was watching Germany. While Neville Chamberlain's government pursued the policy of appeasement with a kind of desperate optimism that bordered on delusion, Churchill stood in the House of Commons year after year and told anyone who would listen what was coming. He read intelligence reports. He met privately with diplomats and military officers. He understood with a clarity that seemed almost prophetic that Adolf Hitler was not a man to be reasoned with, not a politician who would be satisfied with territorial concessions, not a grievance to be managed. He was a catastrophe waiting to be released. Nobody wanted to hear it. The prevailing mood in Britain in the mid-1930s was exhaustion. The memory of the First World War was still raw, the casualties still unburied in the national psyche, and the idea of another European conflict was simply unbearable to contemplate. Churchill's warnings were dismissed as warmongering, as the obsessions of a man who had never recovered from Gallipoli, as the noise of a has-been looking for relevance. In 1938, when Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich waving his piece of paper and speaking of peace in our time, Churchill rose in Parliament and delivered a verdict that his colleagues found offensive in its bluntness. "We have suffered a total and unmitigated defeat," he said. The House was not pleased. 1 year later, Hitler invaded Poland. On the 3rd of September, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. And Neville Chamberlain, facing the collapse of everything he had believed, appointed Winston Churchill, the man he had spent years ignoring, as First Lord of the Admiralty. The signal that went out to the British fleet that day has become famous. 3 words: Winston is back. 8 months later, as German forces swept through the Low Countries and France began to collapse, Chamberlain resigned. On the 10th of May, 1940, Winston Spencer Churchill became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He was 65 years old. He had spent the better part of a decade in the political wilderness, and the war he had been warning about for years had just, in the space of a few weeks, consumed most of Western Europe. He walked into Downing Street with no illusions. France would fall. It was already falling. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped at Dunkirk. The United States had not yet entered the war. The Soviet Union was, at that moment, still bound to Germany by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Britain stood, for a time, effectively alone. His first speech to the House of Commons as Prime Minister was not comforting. It was honest, devastatingly, almost brutally honest, in a way that no one in that room had perhaps experienced from a political leader before. He did not promise easy victory. He did not offer comfortable reassurances. He said, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." He asked the nation to accept suffering as the price of survival, and he told them, with the full weight of everything he was, that he believed they were capable of paying it. In those months of 1940, Churchill's personal conduct in office was extraordinary. He slept little and worked constantly, dictating memoranda and speeches from his bed at all hours, moving between Downing Street, the cabinet war rooms buried under Whitehall, and the countryside estates where strategy was debated through the night. He flew to Paris, he flew to North Africa, he flew to Washington. He flew at an age and with a constitution that would have grounded most men years earlier, driven by something that went beyond ambition, a conviction, deep and unshakable, that this was what he had been built for. The speeches mattered enormously. In an age before television, when radio carried words directly into living rooms and kitchens and air raid shelters, Churchill's voice became the sound of resistance itself. The rhythm of his sentences, the long, rolling periods, the sudden short, declarative statements, the way he used pause and emphasis like a conductor uses silence, created an experience that was almost physical. People wept. People stood up in their parlors as they listened. People who had lost everything in the bombing of their cities found in those words something they could hold on to. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." There were, of course, decisions that history judges more harshly. There were strategic choices that cost lives. There were moments when Churchill's certainty overrode the advice of his generals. There were episodes in India, in the Middle East, in the conduct of the war's politics, that reveal the full complexity of the man, the contradictions and the blind spots that coexisted with the genius. History is not made by simple people, and Winston Churchill was not a simple person. But in the summer of 1940, when Hitler's generals were drawing up plans for the invasion of Britain, and the Luftwaffe was reducing English cities to rubble night after night, Churchill held. He held the cabinet together when members wanted to negotiate. He held the public together through the sheer force of his refusal to acknowledge that defeat was possible. He held the alliance together, charming and cajoling and arguing with Roosevelt and Stalin in equal measure, building the coalition that would, after years of terrible cost, finally turn the tide. On the 8th of May, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Churchill appeared on the balcony of the Ministry of Health in Whitehall before a crowd of hundreds of thousands, and the city that had endured 5 years of blackouts, bombs, and rationing erupted in celebration. He was the hero of the moment. He was, in that instant, something close to irreplaceable. 2 months later, the British people voted him out of office. The general election of July 1945 produced one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of British democracy. Churchill and the Conservative Party were swept aside by Clement Attlee and the Labour Party, who won by a margin that no one, including, it is said, Churchill himself, had anticipated. The man who had saved the country from Hitler was not the man the country wanted to rebuild its peacetime future. The soldiers coming home from the war, the workers who had endured the Blitz, the families who had sacrificed everything, they wanted a welfare state, a national health service, a different kind of Britain than the one Churchill represented, and they voted accordingly. Churchill received the news at his counting station on election night. Those who were present described a moment of profound, private devastation, a stillness that passed quickly, replaced almost immediately by the composed mask of a public figure.
His wife, Clementine, reportedly told him it might be a blessing in disguise. Churchill replied with the dry precision that was always part him, "I see at the moment it seems quite effectively disguised." He returned to Chartwell. He painted, he wrote, he served as the leader of the opposition in Parliament, and he gave speeches that shaped the post-war world, including the famous 1946 address at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, where he spoke of an iron curtain descending across Europe, a phrase that defined the Cold War for the generation that would have to live through it. In 1951, at the age of 77, he was elected Prime Minister again. He received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953, and he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II that same year. He resigned from Downing Street in April 1955 at the age of 80, his health finally failing under the accumulated weight of strokes, age, and decades of extraordinary effort. He remained in Parliament until 1964, 64 years in public life, representing 5 different constituencies, serving under 6 monarchs. On the 24th of January 1965, 90 years after his premature arrival at Blenheim Palace, Winston Churchill died at his home in London. The state funeral that followed was the largest in British history. Heads of state and monarchs from around the world gathered in London. The coffin was carried through streets lined with hundreds of thousands of people standing in silence. As the barge carrying his body passed along the Thames, the cranes of the London docks, operated by dockers who had fought through the Blitz, who had built the ships of war, who had survived by their own stubborn refusal to give up, dipped their jibs in salute. There is a temptation at the end of a story like this to offer a final verdict, to say that Churchill was great or complicated or both, and to leave it there. But the truth of his life resists that kind of neatness. He was a man who carried wounds from childhood into old age without ever fully allowing them to soften him. He was a man who failed catastrophically, returned from those failures, failed again, and returned again, until the moment when his particular combination of courage and stubbornness and vision aligned with the precise circumstances that demanded exactly those qualities. History, it seems, had been waiting for him all along.
What made Churchill who he was? Was it the cold father who told his son he would amount to nothing? The nanny who gave him the love his parents withheld? The years in the political wilderness that taught him to endure? The speeches that gave a nation its voice in the dark? Perhaps it was all of it. Perhaps the Lion of England was made, piece by painful piece, from every wound that had been inflicted upon him and every battle he had refused to lose. We have come to the end of this journey, and what a journey it has been. From the lonely boy at boarding school writing letters no one answered, to the old man standing on the balcony of history while his nation finally exhaled. Thank you for staying with this story until its last word. Your time and your attention mean everything. The best is always yet to come. Was Churchill a true hero, or was he something far more human and, for that reason, far more remarkable? Leave your answer in the comments below. Subscribe so you never miss another story like this one, and stay for the next chapter, because history, as Churchill himself knew better than anyone, never stops.